Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to just try to draw out the state-business relationship and use the big tech sector and taxation as a lens through which to try to understand some of these issues. And a lot of what I'll be talking about today really draws upon liberally my own broad research, which I'm trying to bring together into a presentation like this and open it up for discussion. But like many of the academics who spoke today, I feel that I'm here more to listen to other people and actually learn from those who are directly involved in this space. So there's kind of three motivating questions here to consider, and which informs my research. The first motivating observation is that the level of concentrated wealth and power in the big tech sector today is unprecedented in the history of the international political economy. I don't think that observation will come as news to anybody in this room. Secondly, this concentrated wealth and power is a direct threat to democracy. And I think this was something that was discussed quite at length already today. And thirdly, the tension between capitalism and democracy, business and the state, if you like, is directly observable in the ability of big tech corporations to aggressively reduce their fiscal and tax obligations. And from a political science, political economy perspective, I think this raises four important questions over which we don't actually have we have some research, and many people even in this room have done research on this, but these are the kind of core questions that I think really need to be addressed. And it touches on some of the presentations that have taken place today on the nature and the concept of business power. Firstly, who exactly are the legal accountants that create the global profit shifting and tax avoiding structures of big tech groups today? Who are these legal accountants? What is the role of law? What is the role of the legal profession in particular in structuring this process? Secondly, what is the role of small states in this process? And I say small states, I should probably concretely say small European states like Ireland in this process. Thirdly, does this concentration of wealth and power, or does this ability to aggressively avoid and reduce your tax obligations lead to an increased concentration of wealth and power? Is there a direct correlation between the concentrated economic power that these companies have and their ability to effectively avoid and minimize their fiscal and tax obligations? And finally, what are the implications of all of this for democracy? And I think this final question is perhaps what motivates most people in this room. So my framework of thinking about this, or the analytic framework, really stems from the following four features or observations of the political economy today. Firstly, a defining feature of contemporary digital capitalism is legally coding intellectual property rights and intangible capital into wealth-producing assets. And I'm heavily influenced here by Katharina Pistor and her work on the Code of Capital. Secondly, on the basis of this intellectual property, multinationals use highly complex and opaque legal accounting techniques to create complex global structures to license this intellectual property via low-tax jurisdictions and states. Thirdly, the nature of the game, ultimately, is to protect profits. And it's ultimately about protecting profits that are derived from intangible capital assets and data-rich technologies. That is, capital that is not actually linked to any physical presence. And finally, small states and the legal accounting profession are key political actors that structure this process through exercising what I call important legal business power within and on behalf of the big tech transnational sector today. So to tease out some of this, we can think about various big tech companies, what I call the mafia: Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Alphabet. All of these companies use small European and Asian states to manage and license a large amount of their intellectual property. Take Alphabet, which is the ultimate parent of Google's corporate group, which is made up of over 400 plus, depending on the day, they increase almost on a daily basis, 400 subsidiaries and holding companies across 60 jurisdictions across the globe. In 2019, and in response to the various OECD BEPS reform processes and pressure from the European Commission, They moved their intellectual property license to Delaware via Singapore after the closure of the double Irish, that is the Irish-Bermuda tax avoiding profit shifting structure that had been in place for the previous 15 years. So this movement of intellectual property is key. Now their corporate structure is a work of art, you might say. And for me, I conceptualize their global corporate structure as a global wealth chain. It's a global wealth chain that is designed to reduce taxable income, and reducing taxable income is a key part of the process, to protect profit, and ultimately to avoid democratic regulation. This is a very brief map. I know you probably can't see it very clearly here, and I've been trying to work for many months now on how to visualize these wealth chains and corporate maps, because just even getting this type of data requires scrolling through company accounts using various proprietary data that's extremely expensive, that you need to basically apply for funding for. But it looks a little, this is a very rough map focusing in on the key Irish companies and the Irish US companies. And I just draw your attention to this company here, Regan Unlimited. If you go looking for this company, for example, on the internet, you won't find very much information. You might have 1 page, 2 pages, but you'll not find any information about what this company actually does. It's an Irish registered company that is ultimately housed in one of the big law firms in Ireland. It is named after a 1990s street fighting character in Mortal Kombat, whose key ability was to make himself invisible and to teleport himself into different locations simultaneously. Now, based on some work that I've done, Regan Unlimited basically houses about 6 billion worth of intangible assets on behalf of Google, and I think they use those assets, and Regan, I should note, is the holding company of about 35 and 40 companies across the globe, 2 or 3 of which are German, and I think the German companies are mainly aimed at investing in data centers, right? So the nature of the game is to ultimately direct finance towards the data centers and data-rich technologies. Now, this just gives you a kind of snapshot of the complexity of some of this stuff. Now, the closure of the double Irish tax avoiding profit shifting scheme led to a significant shift in the intellectual property derived profit shifting strategy of these companies, of all the big tech companies. Then the question is, what kind of new strategies, what new structures do they put in place? And again, we can talk about this in the Q&A. I won't go through the different names and listings of these, but the new game ultimately is to use capital allowances for the intra-group purchasing and expensing of intangible fixed capital assets. It's ultimately about buying and selling existing assets between companies, issuing and creating new forms of debt contracts to do it, and ultimately move the intellectual property and license it from somewhere, fundamentally, that allows these companies to reduce their taxable income. Now, unlike Microsoft and Apple in Ireland, Facebook and Google relocated their IP back to the United States via Delaware. Delaware does not tax intangible fixed capital assets. That's why it is arguably the biggest tax haven in the world. And many people in this room will know more about this than I do. And it's far too early to conclude what the OECD reforms will do or what the impact will be. Because ultimately, the intellectual property and the intangible capital has to be housed somewhere. This shows you the onshoring of intangible fixed capital assets by the big tech companies into Ireland since the closure of the double Irish tax avoidance structure in 2014-15. Cut a long story short, conservative estimates based on work I've done would suggest about 400 billion worth of assets have been shifted into Ireland, and of course the net beneficiary of that is the Irish state, because the tax take has gone up. 1 in every 5 euros that's spent in Ireland on behalf of government ultimately comes from the corporate tax sector. Hence the idea which many people have spoken about today, the structural dependence of key firms in particular jurisdictions. All of this begs the question, and that's Regan, by the way, all of this begs the question, what is power in a democracy when the political economy is increasingly dominated by data-rich technologies and big tech capital or digital capitalism? And that's just an open question. So to conclude, in relation to the key framework of this panel, big tech multinationals exercise very complex legal business power to escape democratic control. And understanding how they do that is requires an enormous amount of research. But ultimately, small European states are key actors, key political actors in structuring this process. So this relationship between the state and business is mutually co-constitutive. Both big tech companies depend upon these small companies to advance their economic interests, and simultaneously small countries depend upon these big tech companies to generate the economic resources to function as democracies. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. My role here is to explain why trade unions are concerned by the questions we are discussing. So I would start why they are concerned. They are concerned because the accumulation of wealth in the grip of few oligarchs, like O'Leary of Ryanair, Musk of Tesla, Ioannou of EasyJet, or Slim of Telecom, as well as oligopolistic platform companies, undermines political ethics. We have seen some questions, some examples nowadays. For example, Schröder, who works for oligopolistic Russian company. Then big parts of former Austrian politicians have been found to work for oligarch structures in Russia, just to name some examples. Then it undermines also the rule of law. We discussed this today in the morning sessions. And of course, it undermines democracy, as Aidan just mentioned, which means also it undermines democracy of work, democracy of organized civil society. Platform rules and algorithms constitute a new form of private law, especially of labor law. It is money and not parliaments which decides on strategic issues for our future. And in times of digital and economic transition to a climate-neutral economy, we evidence that this concept is doomed to fail. In the morning, it was already mentioned, this is not only because companies are bad or want bad things, but they just have a partial view of the world. We think that a transition without co-decision on company level, without the inclusion of the knowledge of works councils and organized civil society at regional level will not be feasible. We as trade unions see three weaving errors in Europe. Firstly, from the 80s of the last century until now, competition policy has been based on two principles. I don't need it, just leave it. Consumers and competitors' welfare. The workers' welfare was not included. Competitors were granted a stance in all competition procedures, from merger control to antitrust proceedings to proceedings concerning abuse of dominant position. The decision in all these cases have heavy implications on the development of regions and the well-being of workers and civil society there. However, they have no stance in decision finding. Decisions are taken in a closed circle of competition authorities and employers. So I would like to put it like this: there's a veil of intransparency and complexity. We had also this discussion that the more complex the regulation becomes, the less it is understood even by regulatory authorities. Secondly, competition authorities always run ahead of the market because they do not capture the creation of market power based on network effects. Neither Google nor Amazon or Facebook hold a dominant position in the different markets they are active in, but they hold a dominant market position based on network effects. They influence on media diversity and quantity of data and users. The problem, these are no decision criteria in the merger concept in Europe. Thirdly, the sheer oligopolistic structure cannot be addressed, as the rules for unbundling and dismantling do hardly exist. Therefore, market power cannot be captured in advance as a preventive measure. The good message from our view is we witness at the moment a shift from liberal market economy with the belief that the free play of market forces guarantees the best results to a regulatory policy and public governance. The European Commission as well as the German government want to take their power back. The European Commission plans the recast of competition regulation, the establishment of regulation comparable to the classical physical infrastructure like post, railway and telecommunication in the platform economy. This is an important window of opportunity for trade unions in Europe. Our main messages are: firstly, no state subsidies or public contracts to companies that do not comply with collective bargaining agreements. No public money to support wage and social dumping to secure a just and green transition. Secondly, we demand a new definition of market power capturing network effects and the public interest in open access, transparency of algorithms, and media diversity. Dismantling and break up of platforms and oligopolistic companies must not be a taboo, as well as the skimming off of excess and windfall profits, especially nowadays as we are seeing a rise in an incredible rise in energy prices and oil and gas prices. It was mentioned in the morning, and I found this was a very good sentence. The starting point should be for us: stop protesting after the fact. Thirdly, we want to have a say in all competition procedures representing workers' interest and market knowledge. A public regulator shall protect fair market conditions, establish license fees, and have access to algorithms, and not only that, but also to the explanation of their codes. In conclusion, and now I come already to the end, for trade unions, it is all about creating market countervailing power and about creating strategic litigation alliances. Thank you very much.
I think I can agree with most of what has been said already. What is really important, we talked a lot about free markets and so on, and I want to stress the fact that there's no such thing like free market, or free market is not what really helps here when it comes to market power. We need competition, right? Competition is what really brings the benefits to society, and therefore what really has to change is we need, as a society, we need to identify where there's a lack of competition, and we need to create the instruments to either recreate competition or to ensure competition or to ensure contestability of the markets. So it's not enough to say, well, this is the result of a free market, because monopoly can be the result of a free market. It's really important to establish competition and to keep it in a good shape. And therefore, the legislator really needs to step up and not always be restrained by the fact that somebody is saying, well, look, this is free market, you should keep out of the market, the state should keep out of the market. No, you really should look at the level of competition and take whatever is necessary to increase or secure competition. That's very important for me. This includes, and we already heard that we have some kind of measure to break up companies if it's necessary. It may be the last resort, it may be the last step, but currently we don't have that neither on the German level nor on the European level, and that's That's a big problem because once the merger goes through, we don't have the ability to do something about it. And nowadays with the mergers, we hear a lot about efficiency and synergies and so on. And we never hear about it after that. We don't know 5 years after a merger case what actually happened, and we don't have any instrument to break up the companies, even though it's necessary. So I think that's an important point. Another important point for me is participation and the possibility to appeal decisions. This is really flawed, especially on the European level, especially when it comes to merger control. It's really hard for third parties to have to play an important role in merger control proceedings before the DG Comp, before the European Union. And I think this needs to change. Society should have a seat on this table and should be able also to appeal the decisions of the European Commission. We talked a lot about the fear factor, and we talked a lot about that the European Commission sometimes takes decisions or tries to stay on the safe side. So they won't take bold decisions because they don't want to lose the case in the courts. And therefore, they tend to focus only on the merging parties because they know the merging parties are able to appeal their decision, but third parties are not. If they are not affected in a special manner, and that's due to the firm decisional practice of the European Court of Justice, seldom the case that a third party can actually appeal merger control decision. So I think that really needs to change. Participation and opportunity to go to the courts if the European Commission does not step up its game, and it would balance the fear of the European Commission, because now they only fear that the merging parties appeal a merger control decision, but not that third parties are going to do that. So I think that's another important pillar which should help in the future to have more balanced economy. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And again, thank you for stepping in at short notice. So maybe a round of applause for Kim, thank you. We've got some time now for questions from the floor, but before we do that, I'd like to take the opportunity to just ask a couple of questions. Susanne, you mentioned the role of monopoly power in undermining democracy and in particular undermining workplace democracy. Could you say a little bit more about how that happens, maybe some examples of where that's happened either in Germany or internationally?
Do I have to push some button?
No, I think it should work. Yeah.
Okay. I mentioned some companies at the beginning of my short speech. And I mentioned them because all of them try to avoid the creation of works councils. And it is very difficult. In some we succeeded to have works councils, in others not. And it's also, as they are global companies, having a works council in one company, in one country does not mean that we can create democracy all over the globally acting company. So these are very small victories, very hard to achieve. And if we don't have works councils, it's just up to the management. Any decision about about strategic and economic development of the company, and also where they have their production sites. And this is also a question of know-how. So we have many examples that they just decided to shift a production site from one country to the other, mainly for tax reasons or for state aid reasons. So some countries in Europe, for example, Romania, can offer higher state aid than others. And workers have no say if there's no works council and there's no representation in the management, if it's not an organized company. So these are some examples which I mean where democracy does not work, and we think this kind of democracy is very important for the social development in countries. We see it in Hungary or Poland. There are very weak trade unions, and there are countries which tend to develop to abolishment of rule of law.
Thank you. And then maybe just a question for any of the panelists who'd like to respond. So we've heard a bit about the role of trade unions, and throughout the day we've heard mention of the role of academics and lawyers. Maybe starting with Aidan, are there particular roles that you see within this context of very complex, opaque tax structures for particular actors, whether that's small state governments or non-governmental structures in the broadest sense of the word?
Well, I'll start with, I think, what is the role of academia and social science. And I think it's about making visible the invisible and providing concepts and democratizing the language around which a lot of this opaque activity takes place. You democratize the language, you create the concepts whereby the public can access it, well, then you raise the salience of the issue. But social scientists are often not very good at that, nor are they often particularly interested in it. So if you take even the tax avoidance structures, the double Irish, the single malt, all these different things, the new green jersey, there's lots of economists, and I've recently read an economics paper that referred to these concepts as pub talk, right? And I thought that was interesting because I would thought to myself, well, and we could talk about what each of those things mean, but referring pub talk actually is what mobilizes public opinion, right? So unless you're quite happy with the status quo and you prefer things to be kept highly technical and legal and actually don't give people the language or concepts to intuitively grasp what is a clear reality, which is basically large multinational companies avoiding their tax obligations, well then, it's an issue. So I think making visible the invisible is key, and I think the role for civil society is to get noisy. Noisy politics makes governments respond. And I think for many of these companies, the more that we operate within the realm of quiet politics and technocratic politics, well, the more they win because the issue doesn't get salient in public opinion and governments don't respond. So yeah, I think the role of the academy, social science, is to make visible the invisible, provide the information, the concepts, and the role of civil society activists is to get really loud and noisy.
Great, thank you. Susanne or Kim, any reflections on that question of particular roles for particular actors?
I think everyone has some skin in this game, right? We as citizens should really care. We need to see that how this impacts democracy and the society as such. It's not enough to say, well, there's the economy and the economy is good for me or it's bad for me, and there's the state and it's good for me or it's bad for me. It's the interplay between economy and state and how they balance each other, right? So in the end, it all comes down for me to live as a free citizen, right? Free from pressure by the state and free from pressure by private companies. And I think it's not enough to focus either on one or the other. It's necessary to identify the interplay and to tackle it as a whole. The entire discussions revolving around Trump and Musk and Twitter provides a good example for me, because these platforms are really important for democracy and free speech and how people speak and get in contact and get in touch, even with politicians nowadays. So I think it's not enough to say to separate all these things which we yeah, which we do in competition policy since the 1980s, to say, well, that's for the economics, and politics is for politicians, and we should separate them. It's important to see we are all in the same boat here.
Thank you. Susanne?
Yeah, I would see our role, our special role in creating countervailing market power, as I mentioned. It is especially important because we see the increase of atypical work. So in Europe, it's 40% of bogus self-employed who do not profit from labor law. So it will be our role to organize them and also to allow them, for example, for tariff agreements, because at the moment, as it stands, it would be a prohibited cartel, price cartel. So we are demanding to change this approach. And our role will also be to combat against this creation of new private law, as I mentioned before. It's algorithms now that control these solo employed but economically totally dependent persons in the economy, there's nobody, so there's no regulator nor a court who controls these algorithms, which have big implications on your working and private life. It's practically a total control, allowing for total control, putting workers or self-employed under incredible pressure, also financial pressure. And as I mentioned before, we think this increase of wealth, it was mentioned various times, is very detrimental to democracy. We can see this development in Russia. So you have few persons who with this sheer financial wealth can just determine political and strategic decisions without any counterbalance.